if Nora's in here or Phoebe's in here. No. Oh, Phoebe. Yeah, Phoebe, you were in the session. Can someone unmute Phoebe Tickle? Just asking how the warm data lab went. Oh, Nora's here too. Great.
Hi. Yeah, I know Nora is also here, so maybe when she's unmuted, she can chat to it. But I thought, I mean, I think it was an extremely warm and a fast, intimate space. It was great. Nora, over to you.
Are you there, Nora? Oh, there you are.
Here I am. Yeah, it was just a taste, but and it was much larger, but beautiful group of people, and I think it felt really warm. It felt warm to me. What do you think, Phoebe? Was it warm?
Was there a lot of data? Was there a lot of data as well, Nora?
Only the warm kind.
Good.
Yeah.
Great. Hey, everybody. So, yeah, we are going to go into the next stage of the festival. We're about to have two really great sessions. One of them is going to be with Nora, who was just speaking, and John Vervaeke. And it'd be really interesting to see it, like a show of hands, actually, who was here for the opening panel right at the beginning. You just kind of physically raise your hand. Excellent. Awesome. So in the opening panel, we didn't open it up for questions. And what we're going to be doing with the next two sessions, so there's Nora and John Vervaeke, and then we have Jamie Wheel and Douglas Rushkoff right after that in the session. So, and Nora and John are loosely going to be looking at the meaning and sense-making tracks. And then Jamie and Douglas are going to be looking at imagined futures. And there's going to be a bit of a twist though. So this intro is to describe in a little bit more detail how we're going to be doing it. So both the speakers will have everyone will have a chance to explore a little bit of their ideas and just do a little bit of a reframing. But then after that, we're going to do a Q&A. That's not a Q&A. It's an unpanel, which we've mentioned before, which is where the speakers are going to pose a question to us, to everyone, to the participants in that particular session. And then we are going to use meet.ps, so Meeting Pulse, the platform we've been using, in order to, if you feel like you have an answer to that question, you think, yeah, okay, actually that really resonates with me. I think here's my take on this. You put it in Meeting Pulse, and then we have a system whereby everyone else can upvote that answer. And then we will ask the person who gave the answer that has the most votes to engage in the dialogue. And our hope is that it creates a kind of back and forth. So maybe Dan, could you perhaps, I mean, we need to unmute you, but Dan, could you tell us a little bit more about how that actually works practically? I'm just seeing if Dan is here. So Dan, I've just unmuted you and we'll make you co-host.
Hi, yes. Wow, what a brilliant start to the day. I feel really energized by everything that's happened so far. And it feels like it's now an event and everyone's part of something together, which is really exciting. So yeah, very happy to start leveraging some of these engagement tools that we've been working on. And I'm sure you've all been navigating your way around Meeting Pulse so far, and you would have seen the various tabs that we have available. We've obviously been using this schedule quite a lot so far. The polls and the various archetypes that we've been identifying with, and some people have been very creative with their backgrounds and other images they've been using. We've been intermittently closing that and reopening that. So towards the end, we're going to get a sense of at which points people were identifying with these different archetypes to different levels. So please do keep on revisiting that throughout and identifying showing us which ones you're identifying with at the most. And then specifically with regards to this next section with the unpanel, we're going to be using the ideas tab. You'll notice in here that we've got the town hall as one subject line. We've already got some interesting comments and feedback coming around these two areas, and we've got feedback from sessions 1 and 2. So in addition to your thanks, and we're really grateful for the donations that have been raised already, we'd love to hear your feedback from the sessions and what you thought of those. And what will happen when we get into the next section, which is the unpanel, is we'll have one that will appear for John Viveki and for Nora. In fact, I can probably just make that go live now. And within that, you'll be able to add your ideas. Those ideas are going to be essentially your responses to the questions that they pose. And we're hoping this is going to be quite an emergent process, and the questions that will come up will be in part informed by the discussions that are happening. So it's going to be really very much a live way of engaging with each other and getting a sense of what we're building in this field together as a group and as an event as much as possible. So there's two parts to what you'll be doing. One is, if you feel the calling, is to write a response to the question. And then the second part is reading other people's responses and then rating and commenting on those responses as well. And we'll go through a process of seeing which ones gain the most traction and rise to the top.
Dan, there was a request if you could share your screen. Would that help to show it?
Sure. Yeah, we can do that.
And co-host.
Sorry, host is disabled. The host will have to make me a host to make that happen.
We will sort that out in one moment.
But you can also, if you do go on to Meeting Pulse in the background, you'll be able to see, whilst we're waiting, some of the ways that we'll be able to interact with these ideas and this kind of concept of voting and upvoting and feeding back and commenting on each other's contributions. I will also, whilst we're waiting, mention.
I think you are a co-host.
Yeah,
now,
you're a
Dan.
co-host now, Dan. You can go ahead.
Okay. There we go. So if I go into, that's my admin view. If I go into participant view, here, we'll be able to see sense making unpanel with John and Nora, which is currently empty. And we'll be able to add a new idea here, which could be meaning in COVID-19 could be like, and you could be a whole comment piece around that, and then people will then be able to give that a rating and comment on that as we go, which hopefully is going to create some interesting discussion. And whilst we're here, I'll just also point you towards the materials section as we're going through a few things. One, at the top here, this is a link where you can find the beautifully laid out and wonderful work that Ali's done on the archetypes and how you can engage with those and fill into those a little bit more. The schedule overview, which is again a really nice way to navigate where we are, and the donation link that you can always find there too. And whilst I've got your attention, here's some the up-to-date input on how people are feeling, how much they're identifying with the various archetypes. The learner has consistently been really high, which is wonderful that people are feeling with this in this really kind of open-hearted space and want to get towards a more complex and deeper understanding, which is exactly what we'd love to be. But you know, none of them are wrong; they're all right. So I think that's pretty much it. So once John and Nora go live, we'll expect to see lots of interesting content emerging into the unpanel session, and we'll put the question that they ask, we'll add that into the title of the unpanel session too. Okay, anything more I should add?
That's great. No, that's great, man. Thank you. Awesome. So just really simply, so with the unpanel, as the session's going on and after the question has been asked, you log into Meet PS, go into that section, which is the polls, Dan, is that correct?
Sorry, no, the unpanel session. So I can see some questions in the chat. The unpanel session is the main session. It's what's happening in this room. You will be invited to answer a question that Nora and John will be asking you, and where you respond to that question is in the ideas section of Meeting Pass.
Nice, cool. So you go into the ideas, and you don't have to respond to a question. You can also just upload a question or answer rather. You have to like rethink it and reframe it. Upload an answer that you think is really spot on or that really speaks to you. So, and then that's how we'll do the Q&A session as well. So we are going to have that session first, but David, I wonder if you want to talk about the session that's going to happen after that, which is going to be in the same room.
Yeah, so that's at 8:15. We have Jamie Wheel and Douglas Rushkoff together, which is going to be really exciting. So both have been on the channel. Jamie's been on the channel quite a lot. Douglas has been on once, but both of them are. It's quite amazing that they've not actually talked before. Like they've not had a conversation before. So this will be the first time they've spoken, which I find quite extraordinary because they are probably two of I'd say the sort of premier historians or cultural historians of the kind of intersection between psychedelic culture, transformation, and technology. So Douglas Rushkoff has been looking at the sort of the psychedelic history and the kind of utopian history of Silicon Valley and how that got overtaken with a very materialistic, sort of more cynical perspective. And Jamie sort of started writing later than Douglas, but he wrote the book Stealing Fire, all about transformational culture, and is really engaged with a lot of the same topics. So I think they're very excited to be talking to each other, and I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation. And we're also going to use the unpanel format for that as well. So the opportunity to submit an art. So they will submit a question, or they will ask the audience a question, and then you have the opportunity to answer that question and then join in the dialogue. We'll see how that goes. We might also throw in a bit of a Q&A as well. But the idea, as Ali said, with the unpanels is to try and get it away from just a sort of standard broadcast Q&A model. So we've got something a bit more organic and more interactive. So yeah, I think that's going to be really, really good.
Brilliant. So that hopefully gives a bit of a sense of where we're going next. And we're going to use that format tomorrow as well. So this is sort of where we're launching the format. And just to recap on the trajectory and the kind of mythic journey, or to use again, I hate the word journey as well, but the mythic trajectory we've been on. We kind of started out with the kind of bigger framing that we got this morning, which was brilliant, giving us a big picture, and then using that almost as a kind of intellectual fuel and a bit of food for thought to start embodying this wisdom and start embodying this kind of new ways and different ways of seeing and knowing through all the different workshops. And everyone will have had a different experience over the last few hours. You know, you might have done some breath work, you might have done a jazz leadership workshop, you might have done a warm data lab. So everyone is going to be bringing a slightly different way of seeing into these sessions, and indeed into tomorrow if you're here for the whole process. And also just to, as Dan mentioned, we have the archetypes, the little images that you can use and play with. You know, a big part of the idea of those is to play with different ways of seeing things. And even when we can really kind of wear something as a second skin, we can start to, you know, see the world a little bit differently. And it even means if you get asked a question in an unpanel, it might be that you answer unpanel. You might have had a experience where we're getting a little bit of an echo. Go back on. Should have fixed it. No, it hasn't.
No, have you got any headphones, Ali? It seems to, it's very random. I had that happen before.
Yeah, I can grab some. It seems to have been fixed. I think some people are unmuted as a reason why that looks like. Okay, it's fine.
It's fine.
So I think also the invitation with the unpanel and like everything we're doing is to maybe go to your edge a little bit, and I'm kind of trying to start thinking a little bit differently, bringing in that curiosity, bringing that openness. So without any further ado, I think we're just going to begin the next session. And again, it's just to be useful to see a show of hands of who was here in the introduction panel, in which Nora and John, as well as Jordan Hall spoke. Maybe just raise your hand. I'm just going to go, yeah, great. Great. So I think because most people were here, I'm just going to introduce Nora and John as well, because we are streaming this on YouTube, and there might be people here who weren't present there. So I'm just going to check firstly, John, are you with us here? He is. I'm going to unmute John. And
can you hear me now?
Yes, indeed. Hey, John.
I'm here.
And Nora, you are still with us unless you left in the last like 3 seconds. I saw you on my gallery view. But she might be muted. Yeah. 1 second.
I'm
Nora,
here. I'm here.
Hello. Hey. So I think in light of the fact that a lot of people were here for the original panel, I really like the idea that this can become a sort of extension of that. But I'm going to introduce you guys first because there will be people here who have no idea what I'm talking about and are wondering what the original panel was. So this is a very exciting session for me personally, because I admire both John and Nora's work a lot, and both have helped me in my thinking quite a bit as well. So John Vervaeke is an award-winning lecturer at the University of Toronto, and he's in the Department of Psychology and Cognitive Science. And I think a lot of people might know John from his series on YouTube, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. And that has been, I know for many people, a really fascinating resource and a way to start thinking about concepts like wisdom and meaning in a way that brings together science and cognitive science with those topics in a way I hadn't really seen before. And I think that was what was exciting for me about John's work. And I think I've heard a lot of people say something similar. And yeah, and then also like on a personal level, John's sort of curiosity, real genuine curiosity, I think is always quite delightful. And I see him bring that in lots of different areas. And then likewise, Nora. So Nora Bateson is a writer and a theorist, and she runs the Bateson Institute. And Nora has some concepts. I don't even know if Nora would be happy me calling her a systems theorist, really, because I think it's you're a little bit, there's more than that and different. And I think that's part of why I really like your work. You know, we did an interview one time, and Nora said, I think it was on the phone call beforehand, she's like, I don't like to talk about systems change. I like to talk about systems learning. I remember being like, yeah, wow, that really was an interesting shift for me. And warm data is a concept Nora has also pioneered, and a lot of you will have been in the warm data lab. And just, yeah, I really admire Nora's ability to marry complexity with intuition and feeling, and very much, to use Ian McGilchrist's terms, a right brain way of knowing. If I hope Nora doesn't mind me saying that, because I consider myself a right brain thinker as well. So so I'm very excited to have you guys both here again. And I think what might be interesting is to maybe, if you guys spent a little bit of time, maybe 5 or 10 minutes each, just perhaps recapping I think what you guys both share is that the work that what you've been working on for many years is become hyper relevant in the time of COVID. So a lot of the things you've been talking about, the meaning crisis, the fragility of our systems, is now very obvious. And whereas before it might not have been as obvious, it's really in the forefront. And that's a little bit of what you talked about in the panel earlier. And I wonder if you want to maybe just recap that a bit, maybe add to it a little bit as well, because I know you've both just given sessions, so maybe something interesting came up in those. And I wondered if, John, you might start.
Oh, sure. Thank you, Ali, for that very kind introduction. And as always, Nora, it's good to be with you again. So the recap I was trying to about what we did this morning, and then also try to sort of interweave it with what happened in the Dialogos. I guess if I had to, I would say that there's a deep connection between meaning in life and wisdom, in that meaning in life requires enhancing our connectedness to ourselves, to each other, and the world. And that is threatened by patterns of self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior that we have to learn to ameliorate. And then what wisdom also involves is affording flourishing, which is to enhance all of that connectedness for meaning in life. And that involves tapping into kinds of knowing other than our very standardized propositional knowing, but also our skills of procedural knowing, our states of consciousness and our perspectival knowing, our states of selfhood in our participatory knowing, activating and accessing and accentuating them in a coordinated manner to afford the flourishing that is needed. And I think that requires us challenging a deeply internalized, even encrusted model we have of ourselves as just being sort of holders of beliefs, and that there's really only one state of consciousness that gives us access to the world, and that we reason to reason or reflect or try to overcome self-deception is something we should primarily do in a monologic fashion, and that we're kind of a singular thing, a mono-egoic, we're just a single ego, and all of those things need to be challenged. We're multiple, and we're extended, and we're embodied, and we're embedded, and we're dynamic both within and without. And you know, as Nora is always right to point out, this is incredibly self-organizing, incredibly complex. And so part of what's lost in the meaning crisis is an ability to foster those connections, because we don't know how to appropriately develop the virtues, which is coming out in the Dialogos, which is this very complex set of virtues, set of skills, set of sensibilities, you know, a set of ways of ultimately making sense and committing ourselves to action. We don't know what it is to cultivate the virtue of wisdom. So part of the question I want to ask the audience is sort of a two-part question, but I think it's fair to do it this way. And it's, where do you go for wisdom now? And what do you find there? That's what I want to know. That's what I really want to know.
Wonderful. Thank you, John. So the question was, where do you go for wisdom now? And what do you find there? Beautiful. And Nora, I wonder if you wanted to do a little reframing and pose your own question as well.
Yeah, and thank you, John, because there's just so much overlap in what we're doing, and we have only begun to explore it. And so every time I hear John talk, I just think, I look forward to the day when we get to really play with lots of time, because I think that what we were doing in the Warm Data Lab session was really everything John was doing, but we were doing it from around the corner. And so it wasn't really about those things, it was kind of within them. So what we're doing is we're sort of making a space where new ways of sense making and meaning finding just come on their own, because they're coming from directions that are sometimes, well, they need to be unrecognizable, actually. If we recognized them, then they would be part of the existing set of thinking habits and expression habits. So there's so much crossover here. It's difficult to find the beginning and the end, which I love. Like you said, Alexander, this work for me is about how systems learn, which is a tricky thing to think about. All right. And it's easy to get caught in the idea that learning is something accrued and cumulative, that kind of goes in an increasing direction towards some sort of development or refinement. And that's not the learning I'm talking about. Let me just be very clear. I'm talking about the learning of how a child learns to be in a family, how a tree learns to be in its particular spot in the woods, how a culture learns to be in relationship to other cultures and the institutions within it. So that's a different kind of very mutual, very complex learning. When you learn to play a violin, where is the learning? Is it in your hands? Is it in your right brain, left brain? Is it in the music? Is it in the teacher? Is it in the history of the instrument? Is it in your emotions? Where's the learning? Is it in the audience? And so that's a way of just kind of illustrating very quickly that there's it's in the relationship, obviously, between all of those things. And that relationship is not static. And so I think that's where I would like to pose my question of how would you like to think about developing ways of thinking and going forward from here that are recognizing in the old sort of trope of it that change changes change. And if there's going to be a way to move in this moment, it's going to have to be able to change. So it's a tricky question of how we think about going forward without getting caught in a definition or a plan, because that has to be able to change.
Hi, Nora. Thank you for that. Just wondering if you could make it slightly more concise so that we can type it up. If that's your question.
It's a wonderful concept, but yeah, that'd be very useful to boil it down a bit.
Okay. Look, how do we think about change that isn't a methodology?
That's very concise. Thank you. And I wonder, while we're waiting for people to have a little bit of time to digest that, maybe the next 5-10 minutes before we start selecting answers, I thought I might pose John's question to you, Nora, first, and just ask, where do you go for wisdom?
Everywhere. I mean, literally everywhere. I talk to my kids, I go to my garden, I talk to you guys, I look in the right wing social media mess. I go poking around under rocks and look at bugs. I sit quietly. I listen to music. I spend time with my husband. I study old books, new books. I go everywhere. And in all sorts of cultures and in many different sectors, with lots of age groups. That's where I go, and then I mix it all up.
Wonderful, thank you. And John, I'm gonna flip that around as well to you. Nora's question around how do we start moving towards change, or I suppose talking about change in a way that's not a methodology, that stays in that kind of uncertainty. Unmute you as well, John. I think you're still muted. I'm just gonna try and fix that. Let's see when that's happening. There we go.
Can you hear me now?
We can.
Okay. Yeah, there's some sort of like meta unmuting and muting that are interfering with each other at times. Yeah, so I think that's an excellent question. And then what comes to mind is the kind of change that that you really can't plan for. And so I've been very privileged to talk to and work with L.A. Paul, who wrote the book literally on transformative experience, and also do work with Agnes Callard. And I like Agnes Callard's term about this, but L.A. Paul's point is, you know, when we're actually engaging in transformation, real transformation, and this goes back to Nora's point about a paradox, because if we just make it, then we didn't change ourselves. And if it just slams us, then we just get knocked over. It's sort of paradoxical. When we're really engaging that, we can't sort of plan our way through it, because we can't infer our way through it, because we don't know who we're going to be. We don't know what it's going to be, what we're going to be like when we're there. We don't know what our values are going to change, so we can't use our current values to evaluate it. So how do we go through transformation? Because I think that's the prototypical thing that we do when we're trying to go forward without planning or methodology. That's what I'm taking a methodology to be, a systematic way of planning. And so Agnes Callard offers this provocative notion of aspiration, in which we get into a symbolic relationship with our future self, or mythologically speaking, what has been called a divine double. And we enter into this very interesting, well, I would call it a dialogue, a dialogos with it, in which it's changing as we're changing. It's very much like when you're falling in love with somebody. Instead, you're falling in love with your future self, and they're changing by your love, and you're changing by how that love is reflected back, and you move in that way. So I've become very interested in that whole process, because we can't infer our way through it and plan our way through it. And then figures who can symbolically, in a Janus-faced fashion, act as bridges for our aspiration. And that's why the figure of Socrates has become so important to me, because he is exactly that kind of that. He doesn't offer a methodology. In fact, he continually undermines people who try to bring a methodology to bear on the transformation that he's trying to draw forth. So that's what I would say to that.
Wonderful. Thank you both. It's really great to hear you guys answering each other's questions. We're going to now go to some of the first answers. So Dave Pendle, you had an answer to John's question, and then we'll go to one of the answers to Nora's. And we're just trying to find you. So we're going to unmute you, Dave. Can you say something so we can?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can't see you, but we know you're Dave Pendle.
Okay, I'm turning the camera on. Cool. Hi, you want me to say something about that?
Yes.
Okay, good. I have a long sustained practice of mindfulness or meditation. That's the best term for it. I think I can use so everybody understands. So letting go is an important part of releasing tension around experience. And then having had long held philosophical inquiry, like who am I is the question that is answered by letting go. And how shall I live? That's for me of embodied inquiry. So then I'm very alert to when there's new information or new data in my mind, or old data that's recognized that is useful. So, but that, to say that is what I've learned from wise people. So I've also had spiritual teachers, and that's all sort of embodied from the spiritual teachers that I've been with over my life.
Ali, I'm a little bit unclear about should I respond now today?
Yes, it'd be great if you'd like to, and just if anything comes up for you, John, as you know, when Dave talks, that just builds on your question, or yeah.
I just want to make sure that I'm interacting appropriately. Thank you, David. That there's a couple of things that immediately sing out to me about that. I noticed that. I hope you don't feel I'm foisting my ideas on you, but that sounds very much, and I think it's a great example of what I talk about, where people are cultivating, and I think that's the right verb, cultivating an ecology of practices. You mentioned sort of a mindfulness practice. You mentioned a philosophical study. You mentioned an inquiry practice, a dialogical practice, and then you also mentioned a mimetic practice. You have role models, sage-like figures, and what's happened is they've sort of become like a living thing for you, those practices, and they're interacting in powerful ways. That's what I'm hearing from you. Am I hearing you fairly?
Yeah, I think that's a good description or a good summary. Yeah.
So I think this is just a deeply important point. I think that wisdom is the kind of thing that is best found in an ecology of practices. Notice I'm not stipulating what that sort of practices is.
Yeah.
I do think a mindfulness practice, a dialogic practice, a study practice where we're, you know, philosophically reflecting on virtues, meaning, and as you said, like as I've said, a mimetic practice. I think those are all types of practices that should go into a person's ecology of practices. So what's interesting is one question, if I could, Ali, am I allowed to ask sort of a follow-up question?
You can do whatever you want. It's kind of flowing. There's no,
well, don't do that, because then I'll just recapitulate the awakening from the meaning crisis, and that'll be 50 hours. So I don't think you should give me that permission. Dave, I'm not accusing you of anything, so I want that understood. I'm really asking a question here, because as a cognitive scientist and a psychologist, what concern I have, so I think what you're doing, like I said, I think is really important. The concern I have is, well, you know, it sounds like this isn't true for you anyways, but I am worried when people do this sort of autodidactically, because of all of the ways in which you're doing it autodidactically, people can spin in their own little, you know, right? So what do you do, or who do you go to, it's sort of a follow-up on my question, to prevent that kind of autodidactic, self-enfolding, you know, self-satisfying kind of thing? Because many of the wisdom traditions warn about this.
Yeah. Well, first, my practice of inquiry was informed by being in the spiritual community. So there was a 360-degree reflective capacity. So you got all kinds of different feedback. At the moment, I don't practice that generally, but with my friends, we almost always go there when we meet. So, and we share where our most current alive realizations are. And then, of course, you know, on a daily basis or at work, you kind of encourage feedback from people you're working with. I don't know, could I respond to something you said earlier, which is very interesting to me, is this idea of virtue?
Sure.
Because in a way, virtue has always been, got the accoutrements of traditional religion. But I know that what you're talking about is primarily the virtue is the cultivation. So I was interested in that.
Yeah. So I don't want to take too much more time, because I want to hear from Nora. But that's, I mean, and that's what we were exploring in the Dialogos. So first of all, I don't think there is, I think virtues are, I think virtues form a network. Everybody said that, and there's a moreness in it, because I think that every virtue is actually just a particular way of being wise in a particular context. And so all we're really talking about is wisdom, but we're talking about wisdom is this here, wisdom is this here, wisdom is this here, and wisdom is this here. And then Plato's and Socrates' best advice is we should always only claim to be lovers of wisdom, never possessors of it. And so that's my sort of attitude towards the virtues. I hope that answered your question.
Great, thank you. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dave, and thank you, John. So the next answer is from Jeremy. There's only one Jeremy in the group. So Jeremy Beck, you had an answer rather about stories. I'm just going to double check it is you. Yes, it is. Yes, I've just got your message. So I'm just going to go ahead, Jeremy. You should be unmuted.
Okay, so I was thinking about Nora's question about how do we approach change in a way that is not a methodology. And a methodology to me is a prescribed series of steps that is the same for each situation. It has a consistency. And to me, stories are a way of dealing with uncertainty, of training ourselves to accept uncertainty, because we don't know what will happen. And knowing what will happen does not give you the experience of knowing the story. If I tell you the end of a movie, I haven't downloaded the movie into your brain, I've spoiled the movie for you. We have a sort of intuitive understanding as a culture that this ruins the experience to know the end of a story without knowing how we got there. And we love stories that subvert our expectations, that surprise us, that take us to unexpected places, and that even resist synopsis, where you can't tell someone the ending because it would make no rational sense. And that's as far as I got.
That's great. Thank you. Nora, I'm going to unmute you. I'm not sure if you muted yourself, but it is a wonderful game of back and forth with the mute. There we go.
I think it's an interesting thing with stories. I really love what you just said, and I guess one thing that comes up for me right away is that there are a lot of people out there using story, and sometimes I love the way it's being used because it's really alive and it can move, and then there's other ways in which I find the way of talking about story to be really flattening of the story itself. And there's a good deal of discussion around narrative, actually, and how, we have to change the narrative. And there's something wrong. Something about that statement feels limiting to me, in the same way that you're talking about a story being spoiled. That if there's a conscious purpose in the narrative changing, then there's something about the discovery of the actual story where the mutual learning gets, where the aliveness is limited at best, if not gone. And so I think for me, one of the interesting things about story is that, I think story, if you look at it from one direction, is what the world is made of. The story of how, a little sprout makes it to life in a particular piece of soil is a story. How that soil came to get its richness, it's a story. And it involves lots of different participants. But kind of right on the other side of that mountain, there's a question. And for me, that's sort of the interesting bit, is what are the questions into which stories get woven? Right? So instead of saying we have to change the story, what if we're really wondering how we can change the question into which narratives are spun? You can't really help but spin narratives into questions. It's a deep process, and they come from all different contexts. So, and they weave these things together, they soak them together. The word that I love to use is the intersteep. It's not a real word, but I decided that it should be. Because things get so mixed together that you can't possibly pull them apart. Like trying to get the peppermint flavor out of your peppermint tea after the tea bag has been steeping. You can't get it unsteeped. So I think this comes into that question too, around imagining the future of what are the questions that we're living into and that we're moving into, and those will make the stories. I don't know if that works with what you said, but I feel like it does.
Yeah, I actually would love to know more about, because I think either you or John were talking in this earlier about the boundaries of the self. Where do you end? Where are your boundaries? And talking about expanding a story into questions and how that relates to, like, what are the boundaries of a story versus what are the boundaries of us, of ourselves?
Yeah. I think there's, if you ask, what does it mean to be a success? Right? There's a whole lot of story in that ties us into all kinds of existing system traps. So we could ask, how do we change the system? And we could try to change the system, but if actually being relevant to our fellow community and are the people that we love, if being relevant means that we somehow have to have partaken in these processes, how do we change a system that we actually need for interpersonal relevance? You see, so there's for me, it's a question of what level we're playing at or how we come at this, because it's really easy to get caught in eddies of things that go round and round. And, you know, I mean, I think it's been decades that there's been some very similar questions rolling around about how do we change the system.
Thank you both. Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you, Nora. So next up we have Becky, who had a question for John, or sorry, an answer for John rather. Becky, I'm just gonna unmute you. And you are muted, Becky. Your question, you had a question around opposites, I believe, or an answer rather.
Actually, John.
It's actually me.
Oh, hey.
We're on the same computer now. So what came up for me when I was listening to Nora's answer to John's question was kind of, she's saying, well, everywhere, you know, and it's in the relationships between the things. And so then what the question I was asking after hearing that was like, well, what's the feeling of that? What's the mechanism by which you tune into the relationships between all of the different places where you might get wisdom from? And yeah, it seems to me like so much of the time it's about noticing the pull to one thing or another, to one story or narrative or to one way of thinking, and kind of resisting that pull and staying between two poles, and seeing how long you can hold that for and how much tension between kind of pairs of what seems like opposites, even if it isn't really. Yeah, seeing how long you can hold that for and what happens in that space if you're able to hold that space.
Great, thank you. So I think that originally was, well, it applies to both Nora and John, but I wonder if, John, you want to speak to that, about that concept of the two poles. I know it's a big concept in Taoism, for example, so maybe there's something to be said for that. I'm just gonna unmute you and make sure that we can make you co-host so you guys can unmute yourselves. You have to do this each time. Okay, 1 sec. There you go, John, you're unmuted.
Great. So that's an excellent answer because it feeds back into a question. So I take that answer very seriously, because I think that goes to the heart of not just the work I do in this venue, but the heart of my scientific work. That's exactly where you're putting your finger on when I'm talking about. I think when I'm talking about relevance realization, how things stand out for us, how they catch our attention, what we commit to, and how it's a dynamic and it's always fluid. And there's this salience landscape, and trying to not just suffer our salience landscape, but participate in it, I think is what you're putting your finger on. And I think that's exactly right. Many of the people who are scientifically studying wisdom talk about this notion of balance, which I think you're articulating. And for me, that goes down to, all that living things have these tremendous trade-off relationships, right? Here's one we're doing right now. We're always playing between individuation and participation, right? We're always playing between the inner and the outer. We're always playing between what's needed now and what's needed later. Yeah, and so I think properly bringing virtue into our salience landscaping such that we are, if you'll allow me to twist the term, so we're constantly tempted in balance to what is better, to what is good. Yeah, I think that's a key thing. That's a key thing. Many different, both current researchers and I think the ancient traditions. You know, Socrates famously, you know, people say, well, he claimed to not know anything. Actually, he claimed to know quite a few things. He claimed to know the unexamined life is not worth living. And he claimed to know ta erotica, which doesn't mean he was really good in bed. I have no knowledge about that. What it meant was he knew what to care about. He knew how to properly care. He had this deep virtue. And I think you're putting your finger on that. And that what I think a question that emerges for us, which is the Socratic question, is how do we educate that? And what does education look like around that? That's how I would answer that question.
Thank you very much, John. That's a great answer.
Thank you.
Thanks to both of you guys. And next up we have Christian, who has an answer to Nora's question. And Christian, I'm just going to unmute you. Christian Dunka, you're unmuted.
Okay. Yep. So my answer to Nora Basin's question, how do we deal with change that is not methodical? And my answer was to embrace the liminal, to go on the nice edge of your thinking. And that's a Peter Limberg term. I could have just stole it from him. And yeah, be in community with people who challenge you and support you. And I think it's a really good way of expanding your thinking to not assume what you know, but it's always trying to assume that you don't know, and always explore the edge of your thinking. So that's what I had in mind.
Thank you. And Nora, you should be able to unmute yourself now. There we go.
Victory. Yeah, I love that, Christian. And I find that when those moments come up and they can come up all day long. It isn't something you have to go out of your way to find. The opportunities to see things in new ways and be confused by life are everywhere. But I think there's a particular experience of that is it's a particular kind of disorientation. And the ways in which I've experienced it have lately have been in circumstances where I thought I knew, and then I didn't know, and it took me a while to even see what I didn't see. And that's particularly true in circumstances where you're in a place you've never been before, and you have a sense that you think you know where something is, but you don't, and you're wrong. And there's this physical reorientation, or you taste something you've not tasted before, and you start to attach it to the familiar. It tastes like apples, it tastes like chicken, it tastes like, right? And that immediate jump to logging it into the familiar so that you can assign it. It is something to watch. I notice it. I live in Sweden and I'm not Swedish, so I'm in a constant state of cultural upheaval in my own house. And that can be really painful, or it can be an adventure, or it can be really hilarious, or it can just be a mess. And I can tell you it's all of those things. But what's important is that we have actually created a frame around it in our house where we have a way to say, oh, this is one of those cultural things. This is a moment where we don't understand each other. Or what am I not seeing here? And that has, opening that space up in the household, it is an incredible intergenerational mutual learning space. And I never know what's going to come out of there. And neither does anybody else. It's completely unpredictable. But when things come out of it, they have lots of layers. So I might learn something from my kids, and in the process of that happening, they learn from me what it looks like to learn something from your kids. And so we're unwriting the script of a particular kind of parenting history at the same time that this learning is taking place. And I think that's really interesting as well. So it's got lots of levels in it.
Thanks so much, Nora.
Am I supposed to end with a question?
No, you're good. No,
okay, good.
Yeah, that's great. So got time for some more. We're going to go to Andres Garcia. You had a question for John, and you are now unmuted.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was concerning, where do you source, where can you go to find the source of wisdom? And I'm in that process where I think wisdom can come from making decisions. So you're making decisions in your life and you start to grow that apparent process of wisdom. And then if you can go back to those decisions and try and learn why you made those decisions, and you can have like a deeper in-depth into the actual meaning of, you expand your wisdom. So for me, it's that exercise that you can find wisdom in your own life. So it's a life experience, even going back to your childhood, your experiences in life. If you can go back and relive them and see how you felt and how you can bring that to the future and understand it deeper, I think it's a very interesting exercise and source of wisdom.
Thanks, Andres. And John, you should be able to unmute yourself now as well.
Yep, that's now working. Thank you, Ali. I want to make sure I'm understanding the answer. So the answer is, it's possible to go back, and I like what you said about reliving past experiences, but from now an alternative perspective, namely the perspective of the person you are now. And this is a way of becoming wiser. And there's good cognitive science to support that. You can also broaden that technique. You can generalize it. So what's happening when you do that? I mean, if you have the appropriate virtues, if you're being honest with yourself, if you're not bullshitting, if you're not rewriting the past so that you come out looking like the hero, and we're all prone to that. I'm not accusing you, right? But if you can do that virtuous thing, then what's interesting is precisely one of the things that seems to be constitutive of wisdom, which is this taking a higher order perspective on your perspective. And what you're talking about is doing that. You have your current self, all right, and you're looking back at a previous perspective. And it's interesting that that belongs to a family of practices you can do. You can also do something very similar for a current situation. You can imagine a wiser future self of you for your current situation when you're trying to make a decision. And what that can do is that can actually help you frame it better, have insight about it. This is called the Solomon factor. This is why you seem so much wiser to other people than you do to yourself, right? And so what that means is when you're in the middle of a really thorny problem, and Igor Grossman has a lot of work showing this, and you're really locked in, try re-describing it as if somebody else was describing that problem. So from a third person perspective, and it's amazing what happens when people shift from the first to the third person perspective, the kind of insights they have. So I think what I would say is, I think you're right, but what I would want to do is situate it into a larger, it's a member of a family of practices where we are trying to take higher order perspectives on lower order perspectives. And that really facilitates insight. It really facilitates learning. I think there's, sorry, sounds like a rather pedantic conclusion, but I think there's a lot of good cognitive science to support what you just proposed.
Mm.
Wonderful. Thank you. And next up is Jason Tapscott with a question for Nora, an answer for Nora. I keep doing that. I'll get there eventually. Jason, I'm going to unmute you. Bear with me. There we go. Jason, you're unmuted.
Yeah, just so I know what we're talking about, which question I haven't answered? Was it the methodology one?
Yes. Do you remember what that was?
I do remember it.
Amazing.
I have trying to get my stuff together here. My answer to that, I believe, was the importance of staying open and expansive, having an expansive mind where you're allowing information in, and then staying flexible enough to process that information. Because with methodology, I think sometimes it can get very structured and limiting, and I think that's what Nora was saying. So because change happens outside of that in real time. So I think it's really important to be able to adapt to every single present moment that comes your way, and see, and what John was saying, be able to see things within context, but then also be able to remove yourself so that you can get around your own emotions sometimes.
Yeah. And I agree with you completely. But I'm going to spin on the edges of what you're saying, okay? Because I ultimately completely am with you. However, I also just want to say, like, I grew up in California, and do you know how many workshops I have seen on how to stay flexible and open, and how filled with methodology they all are?
Very
And so,
true.
it's this issue of which is the right kind of flexibility, or which is the right kind, and so again, we come back to this thing that I think John and I have been talking about all day, which is that there are these deep patterns that even tell us how to develop flexibility, or what intuition is, or it's very difficult when you have an idea, or you've been taught what it looks like to be flexible, and then you're in a I have a great story for you. It's time for a story. We've been in this mode for a while. So one time when I was young, back when I was young, I went to India, and I was at this ashram, and my kids were little, not that little, but they were little, and the in the ashram, the men were separated from the women. And whenever I took my little boy into this, we were on an adventure. And whenever I took him in, I had lots of things for him to play with and read and draw and do stuff. But my husband took him one day over to the men's side, and he didn't take any toys or anything. And so my little 2-year-old son went bananas over there. And I could see him from across the quad running circles, and all these people running after him, and just creating a complete kerfuffle in what should have been a very peaceful, meditative environment. And I just have to say that there was someone who came to me afterwards and said, it was so good that your kid did that, because he actually was a reminder for everybody about meditation in chaos. and this with lots of disruption, that there's not just one way to do this. And so I guess there's something about that that has to do with that, recognizing the change you don't recognize, and being flexible in that moment, it is not really plannable. So it's got to be something that's already on board. You've got to be carrying it to begin with. And where does that come from? How do you do that? How do you prepare for that marathon in which you have no map? And so for me, that's really, I think, an exercise of looking from lots of different directions, of practicing speaking in different languages, of looking, like I was saying at the beginning, looking through lots of different lenses, and seeing how wrong the left is, and how crazy the right is, and how your kid describes it, or how someone from another culture describes something. And in that, there's still going to be the voice of definition saying, this is how it is. And that isness is always lurking. So I don't know. It's both, right? Of course it's about flexibility, but that flexibility is more elusive than we would like to think.
Wonderful. Thank you. Both of you, Jason and Nora, for that. We've got time for one more answer, and it's going to be from Laura Marland. Had a great answer to John's question. So Laura, you are unmuted now. Are you with us, Laura? Maybe not. Okay. In which case, I think what we might do, if Laura is not here, is just in the last 5 minutes or so, have some closing thoughts from Nora and John. Maybe since Nora just answered, John, maybe if you have any closing thoughts of, could really encapsulate anything. I know it's been a big day with a session at the beginning and then a Dialogos and then now this. So I'm sure there's perhaps lots going on, or yeah, I'd be curious to hear where you're at right now.
Oh, okay. Where am I at right now? I'm really happy. I really enjoyed this thoroughly. Part of what is really important is not only what we're saying, and this comes out in the Dialogos practice, but what we're exemplifying, right? And this is a kind of serious play, and that's how children move through. This is how children get into liminal spaces and how they aspire to adulthood through serious play. And I think what we're doing here is that kind of serious play, and it's important. Of course, what we say is important. I'm not denying that, but what's being exemplified here, what's being instantiated is really, really important. So when the kind of play we're doing is we're tasting a way of seeing and being that could tempt us to a way of life, and properly caring for that. And I agree with Nora, Blake's poem about, if you bind the winged joy to yourself, you kill it, right, as it tries to fly. And so, Nora speaks to that point very eloquently and consistently with integrity. So, trying to get that we step back and we don't just take ideas from today. If you'll allow me to be provocative, we take temptations to another way of life away from today. And what does that mean? And how does that mean for us going forward? That's sort of what's coming up most for me right now.
Thank you, John. Beautiful words. And Nora, how about you? What's coming up for you right now as the session ends?
I just adore John right now. That's what's real for me. Yeah, that's the thing. It's a way of life. It's how you, it's not even the question, it's how you approach the question. It's the attitude underneath the question. And the just kind of alertness that the stuff that's stirring us in those places is easy to not see, and it's easy to draw lines where we didn't mean to. But that's why, that statement, I'll just bring it back, of my dad's, where he said, "I fear I helped them not at all." And that in that you have both the humility of recognizing the complexity and the deep, deep care. And for me, that's what John's talking about when he says this is a temptation to a way of life. That's an approach to gardening, to making breakfast, to doing work, to being in relationship. There's a lot of confusion right now, and it's compounded as there's systemic unraveling after unraveling, and there's going to be more, I think. So I think, for me, it just keeps coming back to the rigor of that care is a particular kind of integrity and generosity. That's all.
Yeah, thank you both for that. Really brings up for me just a concept that I think I've heard you both talk about in different ways, and that we've talked about on the channel a lot as well, about how we do things being as important, and maybe now even more important in this moment, than what we do, and how we think being more important than what we think, and who we are. Just to speak to that last point you made, Nora, I think that's such an intangible but absolutely crucial aspect. It's this process of being a certain type of person and being a certain way, and having that kind of integrity and that kind of resilience and focus, which hopefully the sessions that we're doing throughout this weekend give us just a little bit more of. I think it's a kind of lifelong practice, but even small tasters can be really helpful along the way. So Nora Bates and John Vervaeke, that was really very special. Thank you very much for all the time you've given today. And also thank you everybody who gave questions. Sorry, I did it again. Who provided answers to John and Nora's questions. It's the first time we've done that. So it was quite an experiment for us, but I felt it was a really nice way to do. And it was really good to hear a little bit, a little bit more from everybody. So we're going to have a break now for 15 minutes. And after that break, we're going to have an Imagine Future session with Douglas Rushkoff and Jamie Wheel. And that's not the last session of the day, because we have something pretty special at 10 UK time, which is Tim Booth, who's the lead singer of James, which was one of the biggest bands in the UK for a number of years. And Tim is used to playing sort of tens of thousands of people. And so it's pretty special that around 600 or 700 of us will get to boogie with him a little bit later on. But for now, it is time for a break. So we'll be back. We're going to close this room, and then we're going to reopen it in about 15 minutes for Jamie and Douglas. So thanks again, everybody, and we'll see you very soon.
Thanks you.
Everyone.
Thanks,
you so
everybody. Much. Thanks, Rebel Wisdom. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Nora, and I adore you too.
Good.
Great.